let's start. We have a small agenda. I think I shared with you.
Sure.
I'll go through and you just talk about those. So
Sure.
first of all, I think you also already gave us a little bit of time frame that it was around the Roman Egypt. So can you elaborate the when the text of Corpus Hermetica was composed, roughly what time frame, and any idea who compiled it and who transmitted it?
Right. Well, they were probably written in the second and the third centuries. We do not know exactly. Some parts might be a bit earlier, but basically second, third century. That's it. So that means before the triumph of Christianity. So we are dealing with with pagan texts. And when I use the word pagan, I want to specify that for me, pagan has a neutral sense. It is not a negative term for saying things that are pagan are bad. Pagan simply means the kind of religious and spiritual and also philosophical currents that existed in the Hellenistic world in that period. So I use pagan in a very neutral, non-pejorative sense. So these are pagan traditions. There are very, very little influence, well, no influence really from Christianity, almost nothing from Judaism, maybe a little bit, but it's very, very marginal. So these are really almost completely pure pagan texts from Roman Egypt. We do not know who wrote them. We don't have names, they're anonymous, but the texts are attributed officially to Hermes Trismegistus. And so this is an honorary term, an honorific term, the thrice greatest Hermes. And supposedly Hermes Trismegistus was an ancient wise man who lived in, much earlier than the second and the third centuries. That's the fiction that is being promoted in these texts. And so you see Hermes Trismegistus engaging in dialogues with a couple of students, pupils, Tots, Asclepius and others. And they talk about, the nature of the world, the nature of God, and the nature of human beings. They talk about questions of how do you find gnosis, Greek term that means direct spiritual ultimate knowledge, how to reach that, what needs to be done to reach that, and so on and so forth. So these are a kind of educational spiritual dialogues. And that's the Hermetic literature. So who wrote them? Nobody knows for sure. My interpretation is that these texts were circulating in very small circles of networks of practitioners who sent each other these texts to stay in contact with each other, because you don't have public transport. I mean, how do you stay in touch with each other? You can only do it by text. So they were, I think, circulating these dialogues as a kind of an ideal text about the spiritual path. They did this almost certainly in secret. It's interesting that there has been almost basically no reports by outsiders about these people. So they must have been flying below the radar. So they didn't attract attention. They met probably in their homes, maybe in deserts, in sanctuaries of temples, and probably the groups are very, very small. The names are anonymous. I assume a little bit that these, when you see the names of Hermes and Tot and Asclepius and so on the text, well, there must be real persons behind them. And I cannot prove this, but I assume that they took on names. So in the ceremonial context, one of them, the leader, would refer to himself as Hermes Trismegistus, to show the position of authority. And other pupils would take names that refer to Egyptian deities, Asclepius, Tot, referring to Tot, the Egyptian god, and so on. So yes, and for the rest, it's a mystery. We do not know who these people were. There are a few names that I connect with these circles. One of them is the alchemist Zosimos, who was working the same period in Panopolis in Egypt, and who's this more or less the founder of alchemy. And alchemy is often seen as the Hermetic art. And so these people were working in laboratories in doing, let's say, chemical experiments and so on. And Zosimus probably was an Hermetic practitioner. I'm pretty sure of that. And another name that you can identify is the great Neoplatonic philosopher, Iamblichus. So you have Plotinus, the founder of Neoplatonism. Then you have Porphyry, his pupil, one of his pupils. And then Iamblichus was a Syrian Neoplatonist who got in touch with Porphyry and has left us a text in which he talks about the Hermetica. And I think that the evidence is very strong to assume that he was actually spent part of his life in Alexandria, in Egypt, and participated in Hermetic circles. So the names are anonymous. We do not know for sure, but at least a few well-known people like Zosimus and Iamblichus can be connected with them.
Yeah, they're very well-respected person at that time, and they're not just random farmer or random manual worker. They're like top echelon of their time, of their.
Yes.
It's almost like priestly class with a dedicated profession like masonry or artillery or some smithing, like building some weapon or some foundation or some building. Like they're more like by profession what we call professionals today, like scientists or professionals. But
Yes.
in their personal life, they are more like a priest and philosopher themselves. But their writing is mostly spiritual rather than practical day-to-day problem solving, that kind of thing. So they're very
I really,
keen
yeah, I
person.
really, let me say that I really admire your clarity. You summarize it so well. It's exactly like you said, and it's true that these people were professionals. It's important they were Egyptians, but they were writing in Greek, and Greek was the language of the higher educated classes in Egypt. So, like you say, these were people, well-educated people. And yeah, Zosimus was a craftsman who spent his time basically, who made his money, made his living by making statues for the temples. And so yes, these were skilled practitioners and professionals, as you say.
So the first reference and documented book that was compiled in the golden era of the Greek literature period. So, but that's not the beginning of the tradition for sure, because they referred themselves. It came from late, a long time ago, and
Yeah.
it was like carried by lips to ear, like an oral tradition, and master to people. Then at the when there is a like political war, all kinds of cultural shift, they compiled at the last vestige that we need to compile these, otherwise this wisdom will be lost. So
Yeah.
that was the last like round of compilation rather than the first initial compilation, right? I think those time they felt insecure that if we don't write it down, it might be permanently lost. So let's write down something.
Yeah, yeah, that's a very good, fascinating point because, well, the question is how old are these traditions really? Of course, they refer back to earlier traditions. They refer to certain aspects of Egyptian religion. There are Platonic references, and of course, they tell us that all of this is very old. But to be honest, I do not know. I do not know how old it really is, because we know that the text came from the second, third centuries. Of course, all kind of ideas may have come from earlier periods, but personally, I'm not strongly inclined to think that they are much older than, let's say, the beginning of the Common Era, even though elements of them might come from there. So I think they're pretty much of that period. Um, but it's true. This point of let's write it down to prevent it from vanishing, it's an important point. There is especially the text known as the Asclepius, probably the biggest Hermetic text. which contains a very impressive lament over the decline of Egypt. So it's very impressive. It sounds like um, written by an author who's deeply saddened and deeply concerned about the fact that all the ancient traditions that have lived for so many centuries in Egypt are declining. The temples are breaking down. Foreigners are flooding the land, are destroying the ancient cultures, and so on and so forth. And they say that very soon, Hermes actually says, very soon there will be nobody anymore who will understand, who will still understand the true wisdom that I'm teaching you. And yes, so it has to be written down. And there is another instance where, that's another text written in Coptic, on the eighth and the ninth sphere, it's called the Octoade et Enneade, where we read a very impressive description of a ceremonial ascent of the soul to the highest spheres. It's very impressive. It's beautiful. And then when that is done, then Hermes and Tot, the pupil, are sitting down. And again, Tot is being instructed to write it down, or not just write it down, to carve it into stone tablets that will be placed in the temple so that this wisdom will not get lost. And so, yes, that's a very important part of saying that this is incredibly ancient. It's under threat. It is endangered. We might be the last generation, but in a remote future, there will be a moment when people will rediscover our wisdom and maybe revive it.
Yeah, exactly. And my personal inquiry about how old this figure of Hermes, not necessarily the book we're talking about, that is second century, as the
Indeed.
scholars has found, and you personally reviewed the literature, you know your stuff. I have full confidence, but I'm just talking about, let's speculate about legend of Hermes, like just theoretical legend, that what culture referred back to Hermes in a same name or similar name, but that person or entity must be very old. For example, I'll start, then we'll continue. For in Egypt, they referred back this Hermes figure to Thoth. So
Yeah.
that's obviously very old. So across culture, let's talk about what Hermes represented in Greek culture. Who was the Greek Hermes, for example?
Ah, yeah. Okay, this is another issue. You're right. Yes, of course, the Greek Hermes is the messenger of the gods, linked to scripture, for instance, to translation, all kind of other things, depicted with wings and with winged feet. The messenger who brings on messengers from the gods into human beings, the kind of God who can flit between over borders that other people cannot cross, and so on, that normal people cannot cross, only gods can cross, and so on. And what happened is that when Alexander the Great occupied Egypt, so that was the beginning of the Ptolemaic period in which Egypt was ruled by the Greeks. So during that period, the Greeks did not try to convert the Egyptians to their own beliefs, something like that. They did. They allowed them to have their own practices, but they translated the names of the Egyptian gods into their own names. And so the god Thoth, who had similar kind of functions in ancient Egyptian religion, the scribe of the gods, the involved in the judgment of the souls after death and those kind of things. It was sufficiently, so Thoth was sufficiently similar to Hermes. And so the conclusion was that, okay, what the Egyptian called Thoth, we call Hermes, and it's basically the same god. So you get this kind of mixture, the Thoth Hermes figure. And you're right, that syncretism or that mixture must have emerged much earlier, during the centuries
Mm,
after Alexander. So this is about a couple of centuries before the Common Era.
mm.
Uh,
That's fascinating. Like in the later literature, Hermes became a very minor deity. But if you inquire that how old is Hermes compared to other like Greek gods, then you'll see, oh my goodness, Hermes is pretty old. Like originally it was just a like harm, just a pillar,
Mm.
like a
Oh
stone
yeah,
pillar. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
the Hermes.
That
Yeah,
one is very ancient.
yeah,
Even before Zeus was worshipped, Harm was worshipped in Greek. So it's pretty old. And
yeah,
if you review uh, the Orphic tradition, they say Hermes was Phanes. So
mm,
it's a
yeah,
very old. So no matter which culture you go, they attribute, oh, Hermes-like figure was the very first person that we recognize. I'll give you one example. For example, there are some Jewish like mystic in the second century BCE in the Dead Sea Scroll literature based on. So
mm.
their Hermes is Moses himself.
Oh yeah,
they,
yeah,
they always attribute the very first person that they respect is
mm,
equivalent of Hermes. So
yeah,
in Egypt, because all the scribe and the priest, they reference their first authority is the Thoth, not other god, because Thoth was the literature, writing, knowledge, wisdom. He
yeah,
represents measurement, everything. So they
yeah,
attribute their tradition back to Thoth. Then in Greece, they attribute their tradition back to Hermes, like older Hermes.
yeah,
Even in like Abrahamic tradition, either Abraham himself or Moses himself or
yeah,
Zoroaster himself. So everywhere you go, this Hermes figure is the first figure who we recognize as a person who communicated some knowledge. So it's very like, I don't know why they have to be very old. It's like
yeah,
they insist this tradition is very old.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And it is hard to, well, largely impossible to to really separate clearly between history and mythology here. So it won't. So it, you know, I'm a big fan of the German Egyptologist Jan Assmann, who's written fantastic works. And one of the things that I learned from him is to differentiate between history and what he calls mnemohistory. On the one hand, history as the attempt to describe what really happened, and on the other hand, mnemohistory, which is about things that may never have happened, but that are remembered to have happened. And so Assmann's big example is Moses, whom you mentioned. Um, there is no historical evidence that Moses ever happened, ever lived. But Moses is an extremely powerful figure of memory, of cultural memory. And as we all know, so the whole birth of monotheism, whether it's Jewish, Christian, or Islamic, traces itself back to Moses. So the mnemo history, the history of as we remember it, is extremely important and influential, whether or not it refers
Any
to actual
historical
historical
correlate?
events.
No. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
There's no historical correlate. It's just a traditional anecdotes or maybe antecedent theoretical. I would say theoretical. That if something comes like that, it must be coming from that tradition.
yeah,
Like so, those are Abrahamic, like Jewish, even Christianity. And we covered Greek, and also we covered Egyptian thought, possible thought. But
yeah,
in Islamic tradition, I would add they even went beyond Abraham. In
mm,
Islamic tradition, they're saying that the whatever whoever is the Hermes figure, the teacher is like Prophet Idris, and
oh yeah,
he was descendant from Seth, the
oh yeah,
third child of Abraham. It's all like theoretical because nobody can prove or disprove anything.
yeah,
So they say that this Abrahamic tradition uh, was post-Diluvian, but only Hermes connects the antediluvian wisdom to
mm,
Abrahamic tradition, and
mm,
from there we got it. So
yeah,
they claim is non-broken chain of
yeah,
tradition,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
very
yeah,
ancient.
yeah. fascinating stories, fascinating materials. Yeah.
Okay, I think let's, because this, if we discuss this, it will never end. So let's move on.